Now, on the eve of the 1979 British election, the Labor Party Prime Minister, James Callaghan, fell into conversation with the head of the Downing Street Policy Unit, a man called Bernard Donahue. Donahue thought the opinion polls might be improving for Labor. He thought there was still a chance for victory. "I should not be too sure," Callaghan replied. "You know, there are times, perhaps every 30 years, when there is a sea change in politics. I suspect there is now such a sea change, and it is for Mrs. Thatcher." And of course, he was right. Almost exactly 30 years later, another Labor Prime Minister had a similar thought, though this time it was inspired not by pessimism but by hope. From time to time in human history, Kevin Rudd argued in his monthly essay earlier this year, there occur events of a truly seismic significance, events that mark a turning point between one epoch and the next, when one orthodoxy is overthrown and another takes its place. There is a sense that we are now living through just such a time. Rudd characterised the orthodoxy that he thought was in the process of being overthrown as, I quote, "free market fundamentalism, extreme capitalism, excessive greed." An orthodoxy which had been called in different countries Thatcherism, Reaganomics, and in Australia, economic rationalism. In his monthly essay, Rudd used its most common name, Neoliberalism, as I will tonight. In this lecture, I want to try to answer, or at least begin to answer, three closely related questions. What has been the impact of the neoliberal idea in the country where its influence has been strongest, the United States? Does the ideology of neoliberalism, as expressed in recent US economic history, bear some responsibility for plunging the world into what is coming to be called the Great Recession, the most serious economic downturn since the Great Depression? And if so, is it likely that the era of neoliberalism will finally now draw to its end? The historian Eric Hobsbawm has called the 30-year period which followed the Second World War capitalism's golden years. This era was marked by very significant economic growth throughout the West, by even more significant levels of international trade, by the virtual elimination of both unemployment and inflation, by the apparent end of capitalism's regular cycles of boom and bust, and by the emergence of the so-called mixed economy, where both trade unions and big business were regarded as entirely legitimate economic actors, where parts of the economy were dominated by private enterprise and other parts, like energy and transport, by the public sector, and where expenditure on the welfare state came to absorb a very considerable and apparently ever-increasing part of every Western nation's wealth. The dominant economist of this era was John Maynard Keynes. He taught a generation that governments had it within their power through fiscal policy to overcome the twin evils that beset the capitalist economy, inflation on the one hand, unemployment on the other. When economies were overheating and inflation threatened, governments could tighten public spending. Public spending could be increased when economies were heading towards recession and the problem of unemployment loomed. Now, for 30 years, Keynesianism appeared to work. Because of the Great Depression, mass unemployment was now regarded as an unmitigated evil. If it should ever return, the political elites feared that domestic communist parties associated with the Soviet Union, the external enemy of the West, would be the beneficiaries. In combination, the memory of the Great Depression and the present fear of the possible attractions of communism for the Western working class provided what I would call the intellectual basis for the Keynesian social democratic consensus, which helped stabilise and, in my view, civilise capitalism. The most important enemies of the Keynesian consensus were the old-style economic liberals, who in 1947 had organised themselves into a high-level intellectual association known as the Mont Pelerin Society. Its most important members were Friedrich von Hayek and later Milton Friedman. Their purpose was to keep what they thought of as the liberal idea alive in what they saw as the era of communism on one side of the Iron Curtain and Keynesianism on the other. The economic liberals regarded communism and Keynesianism, or Keynesian social democracy, as different versions of a single wholly negative trend. Sometimes they called this trend socialism, sometimes they called it collectivism. By embracing collectivist policies like Keynesian demand management or the creation of substantial welfare states, the economic liberals believed that Western societies had, through intellectual error, set out upon a path that would lead eventually to the nightmare of the totalitarian state. They thought that the social democratic countries of northwest Europe had already advanced a long way down that road. The further advance of collectivism was not, in their opinion, inevitable. The economic liberals believed in the power of action and ideas. They were inspired by the insights of their enemies. They adopted, for example, as their slogan, the famous concluding words of Maynard Keynes' general theory. I quote, "Madmen in authority who hear voices in the air are distilling their frenzy from some academic scribbler of a few years back. The power of vested interests is vastly exaggerated compared with the gradual encroachment of ideas." Again, what the British Fabians had once done to spread the idea of socialism through the permeation of institutions, they would now do to spread the liberal idea. The economic liberals in both Britain and the United States created important think tanks. In the universities, they trained a new generation of academic economists. Beyond the academy, they converted journalists and politicians to their cause. The economic liberals always believed that Keynesian social democracy was doomed. Its fundamental weakness, they thought, was the debilitating inflation its policies ultimately would not be able to avoid. A German economic liberal, Röpke, explained the link between Keynesianism and inflation in this way: a policy which sees unemployment as sufficient reason for increasing effective demand is necessarily tantamount to a policy of constantly inflationary pressure. The social evil of partial employment will then be replaced by the even greater evil of general inflation. Hayek himself believed that because of the inflationary threat, the Keynesian Social Democrats were holding what he called a tiger by the tail. Now, in 1974 and in the years thereafter, following almost 30 years of prosperity, all Western economies were quite suddenly afflicted by high levels of both inflation and unemployment, for which a new term, stagflation, had to be invented. The arrival of stagflation was a critical moment in Western post-war history. On the one hand, the Keynesian paradigm, at least as popularly understood, apparently collapsed. Within the paradigm, inflation and unemployment were the alternative illnesses to which a capitalist economy might be prone. Within it, the idea of stagflation was, as I've put it before, as conceptually confusing as the idea of freezing fire or burning ice. On the other hand, the arrival of stagflation gave the economic liberals their chance. Ever since the Keynesian social democratic consensus had crystallised in the early post-war years, had been waiting for the inflationary crisis. They were, as it were, the party in waiting. As Milton Friedman made clear in his Nobel Prize acceptance address at this time, the economic liberals did not now succeed purely or even mainly through the power of their ideas. They succeeded because after the arrival of stagflation, brute facts about the weaknesses now crippling all capitalist economies of the West seemed to vindicate what they had long claimed. The change of era was signalled in the election of the Thatcher government in Britain in 1979, as James Callaghan already intuited, and the Reagan administration in the United States in 1980. The struggle against inflation and the power of trade unions now began in earnest. Now, during the next 30 years, the ones Kevin Rudd talked about, the economic liberals' vision crystallised, first in the Anglosphere, later elsewhere, although in a more diluted form, into what I would call an ideology or secular religion that was eventually called Neoliberalism. With only slight exaggeration, the political economist Andrew Gamble has described neoliberalism as our era's dominant common sense. Although it is true that the faith was stronger in some Western countries than in others, and also true that it was to some extent coloured by the national political cultures with which it was mixed, everywhere neoliberalism had certain basic tenets. I want to give what I would call an ideal typical account of neoliberalism. According to it, national prosperity was achieved by the actions of individuals pursuing their self-interest within free markets through a process the father of the idea, Adam Smith, had called the operation of the invisible hand. Similarly, global prosperity was achieved by nations trading with each other freely on the basis of what was called their comparative advantage, without any form of protection or protectionist impediment. At the heart of the neoliberal faith was the understanding that the market order relied on competition. Competition was necessary for the generation of the vital information on which a market system depended, price or price signals. For this reason, the vested interests which undermined the operation of the free market needed to be tamed. Monopolies had to be prevented from forming because they could set their own prices. Cartels had to be destroyed because they could set prices through collusion. Above all, trade unions had to be subdued because they interfered with the most fundamental price of all, the price of labour, which should be market set, in their view. In the operation of a market order, according to neoliberal ideology, the role the state should play was strictly limited. Strong states were required, but only to defend property rights and create the framework of commercial law. Beyond that, in the realm of the economy at least, there was not much work for states to do. According to neoliberal ideology, most state interventions in the economy did harm. So did most government regulation. Although there were admittedly some problems, like environmental degradation, which might arise from economic activity, market failures, as they were called, of this kind were generally speaking of only marginal importance. Often even these market failures were best solved not by state action but by the use of market mechanisms, according to neoliberalism. Because business was more efficient than government, states should relinquish their control over the nationalised commanding heights of the economy, like transport or energy. This process came under Thatcher to be known as privatisation. Because markets were self-correcting, according to neoliberal ideology, even heavily regulated parts of the economy, like the financial sector, should be deregulated thoroughly. In philosophical terms, the fundamental value of neoliberalism was freedom. Unfortunately, however, they argued, many political thinkers had been seduced by the other great value unleashed by the French Revolution, equality. The only kind of equality not inimical to a market society, they argued, was equality of opportunity. Hayek was even doubtful about that. Its most important expression was equality before the law. But all other attempts to advance the cause of equality in human affairs had to be resisted. At its worst, this attempt had led to the nightmare known as socialism, whose ugly potential was first revealed, they argued, in Soviet totalitarianism. But a more moderate version of the idea of equality, often expressed as the quest for social justice, had also done very great harm. In trying to create a society not of absolute but relative equality after the Second World War, elaborate welfare states had been created. These welfare states, they believed, were the enemies of freedom. They required citizens to pay unacceptably high levels of taxation and therefore robbed them of what was rightly theirs. Even those who received benefits from the welfare state were in danger of being reduced as a result to a debilitating condition of dependency. While it was admitted that no civilised society could allow its citizens to starve to death or die of disease untreated, this minimal level of welfare assistance could be provided outside the market order without the need for an elaborate welfare state. For all these reasons, according to the neoliberal belief, welfare states should be at least partially dismantled. The high taxes and big government associated with the Keynesian consensus should be rejected. The quest for social justice was not merely endangering freedom, it was driven by envy of wealth, and envy was the most base of all the human passions. Now, this neoliberal faith I've tried to outline briefly, to some degree affected all Western and many non-Western countries. I hope my description rings bells, because I think it is the dominant common sense in which, until recently, we have lived. But its influence was felt most strongly in the Anglosphere, the United States, Great Britain, Australia and New Zealand. And I've decided in this lecture to limit my assessment of the impact of neoliberalism to one country, the United States, for several reasons. The United States is by every measure the world's largest economy. Of all countries in the world, the impact of neoliberalism was felt most purely there. All political ideologies in the end are to some extent evaluated according to their consequences, and often the impact of an ideology in the life of a particular country provides for us the crucial test. Just as communism was judged by what occurred inside the Soviet Union between 1917 and 1991, just as social democracy is often judged by what has occurred in Sweden since the 1930s, so I believe will neoliberalism be judged by what it brought to the United States from the 1970s, the late 1970s, until the present day. One thing that neoliberalism brought to the United States was a greater degree of social inequality than advanced democratic capitalism had ever before seen. Between the mid-1970s and 2006, the gross domestic product of the US more or less trebled. The level of labour productivity almost doubled. The Dow Jones Index rose from 1,000 to 13,000. Yet, astonishingly enough, during that entire period, according to several careful studies, the income of the average American worker and family remained essentially stagnant. This stands in very marked contrast to the preceding period of the Keynesian consensus, where the income of average working people in America increased by 2.5 to 3% each year, roughly in line with the general rate of economic growth. Around about 1980, the wages of ordinary workers were decoupled from gains in productivity. The long story of growing inequality in the United States, which began in the 1930s, that economic historians had christened the Great Compression, was now dramatically reversed. From 1980 to 2006, Charles Morris tells us, the wealthiest 10% of Americans increased their share of national income from 35 to 49%. But what was much more remarkable was that almost all the action occurred at the very top of the social tree. By 2006, the wealthiest 1% earned 20% of national income. This represented a return to the position of 1929. Of this, the wealthiest 0.1%, 1 in 1,000, earned 9% of national income. We now live in the era of what Joseph Stiglitz, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, has called trickle-up economics. Trickle-up economics was assisted by two very significant facts during the neoliberal period. Under the Eisenhower presidency, the top tax rate, or marginal tax rate, was 91%. Under George W. Bush, it had fallen to 28%. And by now, a mere 7% of American workers in the private sector belong to a trade union. To put some flesh on this statistical skeleton, I'd like to turn to some of the astonishing income figures contained in Robert Reich's book, Super Capitalism. During the era of the Keynesian consensus, American CEOs earned 25 to 30 times the salaries of their workers. On the eve of the Great Recession, they earned 300 to 500 times their salary, incomparably more than the salaries of their French or German or Japanese or Australian equivalents. One of the best paid CEOs ran Walmart. He received 900 times the salary of his workers, thus earning more each fortnight than they would earn in their lifetime. By now, a top investment banker took home in salary, bonuses and stock options about $20 to $25 million a year. A top financial trader took home some $40 to $50 million. A similar story emerges if one looks not at what the super-rich earned, but at what they owned. In the 1970s, the richest 1% of Americans owned 20% of their country. On the eve of the Great Recession, they owned some 40%. With wealth amounting to $90 billion, the Walmart family was by now worth almost as much as the bottom 40% of Americans in total. And I cannot resist one final figure, although it takes us beyond the United States. On the eve of the Great Recession, the three richest human beings on earth owned as much as the poorest 600 million. Now, when George Orwell tried to give an account of the kind of society he hoped to live in, one of his stipulations was that no one should be allowed to earn more than 10 times the income of anyone else. Orwell, unfortunately, never turned his mind to how this outcome might be achieved without the assistance of the kind of bureaucratic monster state he was thought to have warned against in 1984. But Orwell's kind of egalitarian sentiment appalled the most important neoliberal of our time, Friedrich Hayek, who saw in it the reason the West was on the road to serfdom. In one of his last works, Law, Legislation and Liberty, Hayek wrote, and I quote, "I have come to feel that the greatest service I can still render to my fellow men would be that I would make the speakers and writers among them thoroughly ashamed ever again to employ the term social justice." This seems to me a truly astonishing statement and is at the heart of what I'm trying to talk about today. The ideological conviction that free market processes impersonally determine wealth and income, so successfully propagated by Hayek and other neoliberals, has helped, in my view, blind our generation to both the behaviour of the economic elites for whom free market fundamentalism has provided a splendid rationalisation for privilege and greed, and blinded us too to the moral wrong of the situation of accelerating extreme inequality in the United States and elsewhere. Now, neoliberalism in the United States coincided, however, not only with the extraordinary concentration of income and wealth. It also coincided with the rise of financial activity as the source of both, a striking process that has been christened financialization, economic financialization. Once again, a few statistics are necessary to support my case. In the Keynesian era, 1/5 of US corporate profit came from the financial sector. By 2007, almost 40% did. In the Keynesian era, US salaries in the financial and non-financial sectors were more or less equal. By 2007, people earned in the financial sector almost double what they earned elsewhere. The real action, as we all know, took place especially in the elite financial institutions of Wall Street. Let one example suffice. In 1970, Goldman Sachs, the former employer of Malcolm Turnbull, employed 1,300 people, and in late 2008, 30,000 people. The financialization of the US economy received the blessing and the boosting of the neoliberal elite. This, after all, was what the invisible hand of the free market had delivered. By contrast, there can be little room for doubt that if he had lived to witness the rise of certain kinds of financial activity, Keynes would have been both puzzled and appalled. I quote, "The position is serious," he once wrote, "when enterprise becomes the bubble on a whirlpool of speculation, when the capital development of a country becomes the byproduct of the activities of a casino, the job is likely to be ill done." Let me turn to the casino. In the decade before the arrival of the Great Recession, the most dynamic element in the US financial sector was the market in so-called derivatives, those financial instruments whose value derives from something else, hence their name, like a bond or a stock or a loan. Financial instruments which involve a gamble by a buyer and a seller concerning the question of their future worth. In the early 1990s, the size of the derivatives market was modest. After the invention of credit derivatives in the mid-1990s, most importantly interest rate swaps and credit default swaps, the market exploded. Around 2000, derivative contracts registered by the Bank of International Settlements already amounted to $100 trillion. On the eve of the Great Recession, the contracts were valued at about $650 trillion. $650 trillion is more than 40 times the size of the annual gross domestic product of the United States. In other words, it is a lot of money. Because of the influence of neoliberalism, the derivatives market was essentially unregulated. As Gillian Tett has shown in her splendid book Fool's Gold, an outstanding study of J.P. Morgan and the derivatives industry, in 1994, after a considerable amount of money had been lost by trade in derivatives, 4 bills seeking regulation were sent to Congress. The financial industry was alarmed. It created a powerful lobby group. Not long after, the bills were withdrawn. In 1998, another attempt to regulate the derivatives trade was made, this time by the head of a small unit called the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, a woman called Brooksley Bourne. Once again, the ambition caused a panic in financial circles. On this occasion, the Treasury Secretary, Robert Rubin, under Clinton, and the head of the Federal Reserve, Alan Greenspan, intervened against Bourne. They thought she was incapable of understanding finance. They believed that derivatives were the market's way of spreading risk. Legislation was passed that declared a moratorium on any derivatives regulation. At much the same time, a $300 million lobbying campaign led to the repeal of what's known as the Glass-Steagall Act, which passed Congress in 1993, in the days of Roosevelt. and which had created a wall between the activities of commercial and investment banks. In the words of Joseph Stiglitz, the repeal of Glass-Steagall, which had the strong support of both the financial sector and leading neoliberals, changed the fundamentals of US banking culture. In July 2007, the CEO of Goldman Sachs, Lloyd Blankfein, expressed his satisfaction with the change. Banks were now doing, he argued, what they had always done in their heyday. What had caused an aberration, he said, was the Glass-Steagall Act, now happily removed. From now on, leading US banks, like the Bank of America and Citigroup, and leading brokerages like Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan Chase, Lehman Brothers, Merrill Lynch, Bear Stearns, as well as the major hedge funds, threw themselves with gusto into the burgeoning derivatives trade.